My name is Ellen Dunham-Jones. I'm a professor at Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, where I coordinate our Master of Urban Design degree. I'm an architect, and I'm also chair of the board of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and I co-wrote a book with June Williamson called Retrofitting Suburbia, Redesigning Suburbs. The moment where we really left the city is really the post-war period, and when that was when it changed our public policies, changed our banking, finance sort of procedures, and invested massively in this notion that suburban living was the healthier choice, and that a much better future than that we began to think we really didn't even need cities. A lot of the suburbanization was also led by a lot of racism, and it was just quite simply a lot of white flight out of the cities. The cities were seen more as places where of minorities, they were more diverse, and we weren't, as a culture, very comfortable with diversity. And the suburbs promised a more wholesome but also and much less diverse image. The reality is there were actually always suburbs that were much more African American, suburbs that were much more Asian, suburbs actually have always been much more diverse, and the cities have never been as monolithically industrial or anything, but these cultural stereotypes are certainly out there. Suburbia has been an incredible transfer of wealth and transfer of even the notion of how do we accumulate wealth. It's really only in one generation that got accustomed to the idea that your home, that you're going to expect that when you sell your home it will have doubled or tripled in value. Our grandparents never had that expectation. So the way in which we tend to think of the suburbs less as a place to live and more as this is my investment in my economic future is a relatively new concept, and it underlies both from the individual residents to certainly the attitude towards then how we built the commercial realm. And that's really a lot of what Jim is certainly speaking to. The public realm in most suburbs is really dominated by strip malls and big arterial roads that are the least beloved and the least sustainable places on the planet, pretty much. These kinds of places are places that no one has that feeling of belonging to. And if people don't feel like either that place belongs to me and I belong to it, no one really cares when that strip mall dies, when that bus station gets vandalized, when that parking lot's full of trash. It sort of demoralizes them, but nobody goes out and says, we must do something. You can write off a strip mall. It has about a 15-year life cycle. A typical Walmart used to be built expecting a 7-year life cycle. Now the building's going to outlast, but not the roofing, not the mechanical system. I mean, we have literally built a disposable landscape. When the suburbs were first built, the assumption was dad went to work, mom stayed home and raised kids. Even by the 70s, that was no longer the norm. And dad didn't go work in downtown. Dad went to, now, by the 70s, you already have mom and dad are both working, but they're both working in other suburbs more than likely than that they're working actually in downtown. We now have a huge crop of the millennials, the young professionals who actually want to live an urban lifestyle. Most of them grew up in the suburbs and they're pretty bored with it. They're looking for nightlife, but their jobs for the most part are actually out in the suburbs. So you have more and more people doing reverse commutes, more and more people now working at home, doing things digitally. The whole way in which we use any kind of urban space is changing, and yet the suburbs still are built according to the exact same kind of cookie cutter patterns that we've basically been building them for the last 60 years. In many cases, we didn't really build the suburbs to last particularly well in the first place. Certainly in the US, we built about twice as much retail per square footage per capita as in Canada, so we have even more dead malls, vacant big box. We have about twice as much as you guys do. Retail that thrives now, it thrives the more it clusters. So the bigger the mall, the closer to the biggest highway exits, those malls are doing just fine. The older, the smaller the mall and the smaller the highways that it's located on are the malls that are tending to fail. So as those buildings are aging, the old rug dealer, the old brewery distribution center that Kunstler likes to talk about, all of those old retail buildings, as they die, as their owners, in many cases actually literally die off, that retail's not coming back. We also have seen a real shift in how in the creative class and what they want and expect from a working environment, and sort of the notion, what political pundits sometimes refer to as the office park dad who works in a cubicle. We think Dilbert, the cartoon character. I mean, Dilbert personifies a certain generation's, the suburban office park cubicle working person. And the younger generation, the technically, digitally savvy knowledge worker of the future desperately does not want to become Dilbert. And so the companies are increasingly recognizing if they want to hire the new digerati, they have to locate their offices in more vibrant urban places. So retrofitting the suburbs is simply taking a look at how do we take advantage of the fact that we have more and more underperforming properties as a lot of suburbs are aging. And it gives us this chance now to have a do-over, to make them into more sustainable places, whether it's by re-inhabiting them with more community-serving uses, redeveloping them into more walkable and compact, potentially transit-served places, or through re-greening, whether it means reconstructing the wetlands, putting in parks, putting in community gardens, agriculture or energy production. In most of the time, it's really happening on properties that were developed under a suburban model, and frankly, that model has failed. And now is the time to rethink how do we make these more sustainable? So my database has grown from about 80 projects that June Williamson and I put together up to 2008, and now there are well over 600 projects in there. So there certainly are more and more projects out there, but that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the world of development. This critique is a common one, and I think most of us, I certainly include myself, I love cities that are examples of incremental urbanism, where the buildings are you see a variety of generations of buildings, you feel the patina of history, you feel like you belong to something much larger than just this moment of instant gratification. And that works great if you have a walkable street network. If you've got a walkable network of blocks, then individual parcels of buildings can come and go, and you get a city that is built over time, and which is great. But if you are in a suburban system of long dendritic roads swirling around and cul-de-sacs and lollipop loops, just replacing one parcel at a time doesn't get us anything sustainable. You've got to work in big chunks to actually insert the network of walkable streets, allow it to be more transit served, enable it to incorporate more public space, enable the underwriting of more affordable housing to be included, more insistence on better performing green infrastructure, all of those very good things you can't do incrementally because the infrastructure isn't in place. We need to work at the scale of instant urbanism. And yes, there's the common critique that, oh, new urbanist projects look Disney-fied, they're nostalgic, they are instant urbanism. I look at that as that is the challenge then for us as designers and architects, and for Michael to just sort of point at fingers and say, ah, they're boring. Okay, do a better job, show me, and actually come in. It's absolute, I completely agree. We need to do a much better job of making instant urbanism that we're proud of and where we want to live. But it's not enough to just sort of dismiss and say, oh, instant urbanism is bad. Because frankly, then you've just written off 75% of our built environment, and you've written off every one of those sustainable needs. Really, the question in all of this is, yes, how do you establish an infrastructure that allows that growth and constant evolution? And the suburbs, with their zoning of separate uses and the dendritic system, absolutely makes it very difficult to evolve them. But now is the time. This is the project for the next generation. One of the greatest arguments for density is to be able to make transit systems work. But it's a pretty interesting curve such that if you double density from 1 acre house to 2 acres per house, you actually, that actually has something of an impact. But it's really, once you get up to about 8 dwelling units, which is really still single family house, but small lots, that's the minimum needed for bus service. You double that again, get up to 15 or 20, then you're talking townhouse sort of scale. That means your bus service can now run a little more, twice as frequently. If you double again, and you basically then you're getting up to the 4 or 5 stories. You're seeing a doubling. You see a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. You see transit actually becoming quite efficient. But once you double after that, you actually only get very little increment of change. Once you have transit running frequently and you have enough density to do that, you're not getting a payoff really in more. There's only the transit system can only be so efficient. You hit that really at the 5-6 stories. And 5 stories is also really the limit on wood construction. So there's a certain affordability that's built into, you can build quite affordable units with wood construction. The minute you have to jump up to concrete or steel, you really need to build at least 14 stories to be able to, again, make it affordable. The density, it's not only about transit. There are other aspects, but at a certain point, if you are starting to get a lot of 14 stories, let alone 30-story buildings, if you have them so close together, then you don't get much light, and that obviously can become a problem. But if they're too spaced apart, then the transit, again, doesn't quite work. So there are sweet spots that are sort of, the 5-story hits the affordable wood construction. Urbanistically, most of us like places like Paris. Paris is actually mostly about an 8-story. It's not the most affordable, but it certainly makes for very engaging streets. So many people tend to use the word gentrification as itself inherently a bad word. The problem is the displacement of long-time residents. The problem isn't the answer to gentrification is not, oh, that's an area where a lot of poor people live, let's not invest anything in there. That's not a good answer either. Gentrification is a serious problem, and it's one that none of us have, no community has fully solved. You can do tax breaks for the elderly who are homeowners. That helps them some, but it doesn't help the renters. Or you can do land trusts that might, in some ways, help. That's another tool that helps some, but then there isn't the upside for the folks who are investing. Recently Arlington County came up with 116 points, 116 different tactics to try to improve affordability along a gentrifying corridor. That gives you a sense of just how, there's so many, there are lots of little things we can do, but nobody has the silver bullet answer on this. What you find in a lot of new urbanist projects and in a lot of retrofits are the inclusionary zonings, where you can't tell the difference walking around you can't see the difference between a subsidized unit and a non-subsidized unit. And so people tend to look and say, oh, look how uniform this all is, and have absolutely no idea that, in fact, no, 20% of those units might only be at 60% average median income. One of, I think, the things that distinguishes new urbanism from a lot of more modernist approaches to public housing was that the modernists tended to say, affordable housing should look like affordable housing, and we're going to separate it out and we're going to call it the projects. And everybody who lives there is stigmatized as they live in affordable housing. New urbanists very deliberately mask the differences. You can't tell, looking at two front doors, which one is a subsidized unit and which is not. The debates that we tend to have on affordability within the Congress for the New Urbanism are often on how much can you design in affordability and how much do you have to rely on subsidy when you are talking new construction. And there's very different, and there's a lot of different debates on that, but I think the real piece that has been missing from the conversation on affordability for way too long is really looking at the role of affordable transportation. So much of what we've been really trying to emphasize with new urbanism is linking affordable housing with affordable transportation. In the US now, if you take all incomes, the lower half of all incomes, most of them are spending more on transportation than they are on housing, and yet very few people actually realize that they're doing it because very few people add up the numbers. My argument is we really need to retrofit so many more of our commercial corridors, and where those places along our corridors that used to be retail, and the retail in between the intersections, the retail's not going to come back. That land, if we need to retrofit our corridors to become transit-served boulevards that are safer, desirable, attractive addresses, and then line that with a lot of affordable housing that can then have great access to affordable transportation. That's our nation's moonshot.